Welcome to another deep dive. You know, we always seem to find these reports that are more like something out of science fiction than an actual business plan. And well, this time we're diving into one of those, the Consocio Protocol.
Mm,
It's ambitious, to say the least. We're talking about using technology to, tackle those big dystopian threats that are always, looming out there and trying to steer us toward a more utopian vision.
right.
And they're not just talking about, making life a little bit better. They're aiming for a complete societal transformation.
Yeah. Tall order for sure.
And get this, our sources for this deep dive are a really fascinating mix. We've got their business report, of course, a white paper on open banking, and then some really interesting documents about building better societies.
Okay.
So this Consocio Protocol on Stakeholders Foundation Business Report 2024. This is our main dish today. And right off the bat, they lay out this big, bold vision uniting people through technology, creating wealth, and ultimately fostering a more peaceful world.
Yeah, you can definitely sense that utopian ideal kind of woven throughout this entire report. It's fascinating how they're presenting technology, specifically blockchain, AI, and decentralized finance, as the keys to unlocking this better future, almost like a blueprint for a tech-driven utopia.
Right. It's definitely more of a manifesto than your traditional dry business report.
Yeah, and that raises a pretty crucial question. Are they on to something truly groundbreaking here, or are they getting a little caught up in the hype?
Well, to really understand their vision, I think we need to start with the problems they're trying to solve. And they don't shy away from painting a pretty bleak picture of the challenges we're facing.
Yeah, they don't sugarcoat it.
No, they don't. They call this dystopia dysbiosis, a state where systems are out of balance, working against themselves, and creating a world of conflict, scarcity, and suffering.
Right, and that term really stuck out to me, destructive interference. They use this analogy of the observer effect in physics, but with a negative twist. Essentially, they're saying that even well-intentioned actions within our current systems can have unintended negative consequences.
It's like we're trapped in a system that's rigged for failure.
In a way, yes. And they argue that these problems, things like poverty, climate change, social unrest, they're not isolated issues. They're all symptoms of a deeper systemic dysfunction.
So they're taking a very systemic view of these global challenges.
Exactly. And they get very specific about where things can go wrong. They highlight three major areas where they see the potential for things to really go off the rails.
Okay, let's hear it. What's the first dystopian threat they're warning us about?
The first one is probably the most visceral. They talk about the risk of escalating violence and conflict, often driven by things like growing economic inequality and competition for dwindling resources. It's not a pretty picture, but they argue that ignoring these possibilities is far more dangerous than confronting them head-on.
That's a sobering thought, for sure. So it's not just about wars between nations. They're talking about societal breakdown on a more fundamental level.
Exactly. Think poverty, famine, widespread disease, unimaginable suffering, all stemming from a failure to address the root causes of these problems. And this is where their concept of systemic philanthropy comes into play, which we'll definitely unpack later.
Okay, so hold that thought, systemic philanthropy. We'll come back to that. What's the second threat on their list?
The second threat is the big one climatic catastrophe. And this is where their emphasis on algorithmic sustainability becomes incredibly relevant. We see that term popping up again and again throughout the materials.
Right. Algorithmic sustainability.
Yeah.
It's a mouthful, but it seems to be central to their whole approach.
Absolutely. They're very clear in their stance that the traditional models of economic growth, the whole idea of endless growth on a finite planet, are inherently unsustainable and will inevitably lead to environmental disaster. And they back this up with some pretty hard-hitting data. They even cite specific projections from sources like the IPCC, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, trillions of dollars in damages, the whole nine yards.
So it's not just some vague save the planet rhetoric. They're drawing a direct line between economic stability and environmental sustainability.
Exactly. They're saying that if we don't address climate change, everything else is moot.
And it's hard to argue with that logic, especially when you look at the science.
Exactly. The science is pretty clear on that.
So what's the third threat they're focused on?
The third one hits a little closer to home. They argue that the existing systems we rely on, our political systems, our economic systems, even our social structures, are simply not equipped to deal with the complexity and scale of the challenges we're facing.
They're saying our systems are outdated, essentially.
In a way, yes.
Yeah.
They call it systemic fragility. Essentially, they're saying that our systems are brittle, inflexible, and prone to collapse when faced with shocks or disruption.
And to be honest, when you look at the state of the world today, it's hard to disagree with that assessment.
Yeah, it's a pretty sobering thought, but it's important to remember that this is just their analysis of the situation.
Right, it's their perspective, and they're obviously trying to make a case for their proposed solution.
Exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. They've painted this pretty stark picture of the problems, these dystopian threats looming large. But the real meat of it is figuring out how this Consocio Protocol actually works. How do they plan on taking us from a world on the brink of collapse to this eubiosis they keep mentioning?
Yeah, eubiosis, that's another one of their terms.
Yeah.
It seems to be the opposite of dysbiosis, a state of balance, harmony, things working together as they should.
Exactly. It's their vision of a thriving, flourishing world where systems are working in concert to create a better future for everyone.
So how do they propose we get there? What's their roadmap to eubiosis?
Well, to understand their solution, we need to start with those societies documents. That's where they get into the nitty-gritty of their proposal for a new kind of social contract. One built on technology, but also on some very old, very human concepts.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Think about the concept of e-utilities. They propose things like universal basic resource units, universal basic communication units, and so on. Basically, a system that guarantees everyone on the planet access to a certain baseline of essential resources, regardless of their economic status.
Right, like a digital version of those universal basic income ideas that have been circulating, but they're taking it a step further by including things like energy transportation, even access to data as essential resources.
Exactly, and this is where their tech focus comes in. They envision a global decentralized marketplace where these e-utilities can be bought, sold, and traded using their blockchain-based platform.
Okay, so we're talking about a fundamental restructuring of how we think about and distribute essential resources.
Exactly. It's about creating a more equitable and sustainable foundation for society as a whole.
And that's just the tip of the iceberg. We'll be back after a short break to explore how they plan to use these e-utilities to create a more equitable and sustainable world. So we're back, and before the break, we were starting to uncover some of the mechanics behind this Consocio Protocol. They lay out those major dystopian threats. And now they're proposing a solution that seems to be centered around this fascinating idea of e-utilities and a whole new kind of social contract. It's like they're trying to rewrite the rules of the game.
Yeah, it's a pretty radical departure from the way we typically think about these things.
And here's where it gets really interesting. They're not just talking about, handing out digital tokens or anything like that. They've actually designed the system to encourage something they call systemic philanthropy.
Right.
Okay, now you're just using their marketing buzzwords on me. Break that down for our listeners. What does systemic philanthropy actually mean in practice?
Well, imagine this. You have more e-utilities than you need for your basic necessities. Maybe you've been super energy efficient that month, or you prefer to bike instead of using your transportation credits. Whatever it may be, you have the surplus. And the Consocio Protocol, it actually makes it easy and, more importantly, rewarding for you to share those excess resources with those who need them most.
So the reward isn't just about feeling good or doing your part. There's an actual tangible benefit within the system itself.
Exactly. It's not just about altruism, although they certainly emphasize that as well. They've actually built in several layers of incentives to encourage this kind of sharing and collaboration.
Okay, so walk me through it. How do these incentives work?
Well, for one thing, sharing your excess e-utilities earns you more voting power within their network, something they call stakeholder agents.
Stakeholder agents. So it's kind of like a reputation system, but it's directly tied to your willingness to contribute to the collective good.
Precisely. The more you give, the more influence you have over how the system evolves. That's a pretty powerful incentive.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But what about the people on the receiving end of this systemic philanthropy? How does it actually help lift them out of poverty?
That's where their vision of a social solidarity economy really takes center stage. The idea is that by providing everyone with that baseline of essential resources through these e-utilities, they're creating a much more level playing field. It's not just about handouts, it's about giving everyone the opportunity to participate in the economy, even if they're starting with nothing.
So instead of just throwing money at the problem of poverty, they're aiming to restructure the system in a way that makes it more equitable from the ground up.
Exactly. It's a much more holistic approach.
Ambitious for sure. But how does all of this actually translate into real-world change? How does this grand vision manifest in our daily lives?
Well, remember those ATMs turned Bitcoin mining hubs they mentioned? That's one very concrete example of how they're trying to seamlessly integrate their technology into existing infrastructure. They're not suggesting we all run off to live off the grid in some futuristic commune. They're talking about leveraging technology to improve and, in a way, reimagine the systems we already have.
Right, and that Point-of-sale integration isn't limited to ATMs either. They envision a future where every time you make a purchase, you're not just using traditional currency, but also interacting with this decentralized network of e-utilities and contributing to this system of algorithmic sustainability.
Exactly. They
Yeah.
want to make it so that every transaction has this social impact dimension built in.
Okay, hold on. Algorithmic sustainability, that's another one of those terms they keep using. Can you elaborate on what exactly that means in this context?
Essentially, it's about using sophisticated algorithms and artificial intelligence to optimize resource allocation and minimize waste at a systemic level. It's about ensuring that the system as a whole is geared towards long-term sustainability, both economically and environmentally.
So it's not just relying on people to be altruistic and share their resources out of the goodness of their hearts. They're embedding those incentives directly into the very code that underpins their system.
Yes. They're trying to create a system where doing good is also good for you within the parameters of the system itself. And they've even developed a specific metric to track how well the system is achieving this balance, the Consociation Coefficient.
The Consociation Coefficient, another buzzword. What does
Right.
that even measure?
Essentially, it measures the degree of cooperation and mutual benefit among stakeholders within the network. It's like a measure of how well the system is living up to its utopian aspirations. The higher the coefficient, the closer they are to achieving that perfect balance, that state of eubiosis.
So it's a way to quantify how well the system is working as intended, how close it is to achieving that ideal state of balance and harmony.
You could say that, of course, anytime you're talking about using algorithms to manage complex systems, especially ones with such high stakes, there are always valid concerns about potential biases, transparency, and the risk of unintended consequences. And to their credit, the report does acknowledge these challenges.
Right. It's like they're trying to code for good, but even the best intentions can have unforeseen and potentially negative outcomes,
Yeah.
especially when you're dealing with something as complex as a global economic system.
Exactly. And that's why they place such a strong emphasis on this idea of e-governance, essentially using blockchain technology to create a more transparent, accountable, and crucially democratic system of governance where everyone has a voice and can participate in the decision-making processes.
So it's not just a handful of tech giants or governments calling the shots. They're talking about a more inclusive and democratic approach to governing this entire system.
That's the idea anyway. And this e-governance model, it extends to the development and deployment of AI as well.
So how does that work in practice? How do they envision this e-governance model actually functioning within such a complex system?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and we'll dive into the specifics of their e-governance model right after this.
Sounds good. We'll be back in a moment. We're back and ready to tackle a topic that always gets people talking: the role of artificial intelligence.
Yeah, AI always seems to be at the forefront of these discussions about the future.
And for good reason. I mean, it's a powerful technology with the potential to reshape our world in profound ways.
Right.
And the Consocio Protocol, they definitely don't shy away from AI.
Yeah.
In fact, they had this whole concept of an AGI chairman that they're proposing.
Yeah, that caught my eye too, AGI chairman. It's a pretty bold term, and it definitely raises some eyebrows, especially when you think about all the dystopian scenarios people associate with AI.
Right, like are we talking about an AI overlord calling all the shots? Is that what they're suggesting?
Well, before we jump to any conclusions, let's unpack what they actually mean by AGI and how it fits into their overall vision.
Okay, so AGI, for those who aren't familiar, stands for Artificial General Intelligence, which is basically the idea of an AI that's as capable as a human being, or even more so.
Exactly. It's the kind of AI that we often see in science fiction, capable of learning, reasoning, and problem solving across a wide range of tasks.
Right, and often those sci-fi scenarios don't end so well for us humans.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of fear and anxiety surrounding AI, especially when we start talking about AGI.
But it seems like the Consortium Protocol, they're taking a slightly different approach.
They are. They're making a clear distinction between the potential for AI to go rogue, the whole machines taking over the world scenario, and what they call constructive interference, where AI is a force for good.
Okay, so constructive interference. I like the sound of that a lot better than destructive interference, which is what they were warning us about earlier.
Yeah, it's definitely a more optimistic take on AI.
So how do they define constructive interference in this context? How do they see AI contributing to a better future?
Well, they believe that AI, when developed and governed responsibly, has the potential to not replace human capabilities, but to actually enhance them, leading to a more equitable and sustainable future.
So instead of fearing AI as a threat, they're arguing that we should embrace its potential as a powerful tool for collaboration and problem solving.
Exactly. They see AI as a partner in building a better world, not as some kind of existential threat.
It's a more optimistic outlook than we often hear in discussions about AI, that's for sure.
It is, but I think it's an important perspective to consider.
Absolutely.
Mm.
But I'm still trying to square this with the idea of an AGI chairman. How can they be so confident that AI will be used for good? I mean, we're talking about a technology that's still in its infancy.
Right, and that's a valid concern. They acknowledge that AI, like any powerful technology, can be misused, but they argue that the key to ensuring constructive interference lies in how we develop, deploy, and most importantly, govern these AI systems.
So they're not naive to the potential risks. They're just choosing to focus on the potential benefits.
I think that's a fair assessment. They're definitely more optimistic than some, but they're not completely ignoring the potential downsides either.
Okay, so how do they propose we govern these AI systems? Especially if we're talking about something as potentially powerful as AGI.
Well, this is where their idea of e-governance comes back into play. Remember how they're proposing a system of distributed governance powered by blockchain,
Yeah.
where everyone has a voice and can participate in decision-making?
Right, like that global decentralized town hall we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. And this e-governance model, it extends to AI as well. They envision a system where everyone has a say in how AI is developed, deployed, and used within their proposed ecosystem.
So it's not just a handful of tech giants or governments calling the shots. They're talking about a more inclusive and democratic approach to AI governance.
That's the idea anyway. And this is where the AGI chairman concept starts to come into focus. They're not talking about a single, all-powerful AI making decisions for everyone. Instead, picture a network of AI agents, each representing the interests of a particular stakeholder group, all working together, collaborating to find solutions that benefit everyone.
It's like a global AI-driven system of checks and balances.
Exactly. It's a fascinating concept, this idea of an AI-powered system that's designed to be representative, accountable, and responsive to the needs of a diverse range of stakeholders.
It's certainly a different way of thinking about AI governance than what we usually hear.
It is, and it raises a lot of questions about how such a system would work in practice. But it's a bold vision nonetheless, a future where AI isn't something to be feared, but a partner in building a better world.
A partner in progress rather than a potential threat.
Exactly. And I think that's a really important takeaway from this deep dive. Technology, including AI, is not inherently good or bad. It's how we choose to use it that matters.
It's all about making conscious choices about how we want to shape the future with these powerful tools.
And that's what makes this whole conversation so crucial. We need to be having these discussions now while these technologies are still being developed so that we can steer them in a direction that benefits all of humanity.
Absolutely. We can't just sit back and let the future happen to us. We need to be active participants in shaping it.
Exactly. And that's why I appreciate what the Consocio Protocol is trying to do here. They're not just throwing technology at the problem, they're really grappling with these fundamental questions about governance, ethics, and the kind of world we want to create.
They're forcing us to confront those big, uncomfortable questions about the role of technology in society and the kind of future we're building.
Exactly. And that's a conversation we all need to be a part of.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the Consocio Protocol. It's been a fascinating, if at times, mind-bending journey.
It has, but it's definitely given us a lot to think about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we hope it sparks some ideas and maybe even a bit of hope for our listeners. The future is not predetermined, and we all have a role to play in shaping it.
Well said. And as always, thanks for diving deep with us.